Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really fascinating subject today. It's all about manipulation tactics.
That's right. And we'll be getting all our insights from the Manipulation Bible. It was written by Wladislaw Jachtchenko.
And it's translated by George Robarts.
Yeah.
So this book isn't your typical self-help guide, is it?
Not at all. It actually goes beyond just defending against manipulation. Jachtchenko wants to equip us to actually master it.
To excel in life. Now, that's an intriguing premise.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder,
Yeah.
is manipulation always a bad thing? Or can it be used for good?
That's a great question to consider as we go through this. But first, I think it's important to establish a clear definition.
Okay, so how does the book define manipulation?
Well, Jachtchenko describes manipulation as, well, essentially covertly influencing someone.
To your own benefit. So how is that different from simply persuading someone?
It all comes down to transparency and intent. With persuasion, you're upfront about your goals.
And you're using logic and reason to try and convince the other person.
Right. But manipulation operates in the shadows, so to speak. It's more about subtle tactics and hidden agendas.
Okay, so what are some of these tactics? The book outlines 10 key manipulation skills, and the first one, seeming confident when clueless, sounds pretty counterintuitive.
It is. It basically suggests that you don't actually have to be an expert.
To appear like one? How is that even possible?
Well, one tactic is what he calls abstraction, basically when you're asked about specifics.
You respond with vague generalities. Could you give us an example?
Imagine you're at a dinner party and someone asks you about a complex policy like tax reform.
You have no idea about the intricacies of tax reform.
Right. Instead of admitting your lack of knowledge, you could steer the conversation towards broader economic trends.
Ah, I see. So it's about deflecting with broader, more general statements.
Exactly. Another tactic is digression. It involves subtly changing the subject.
Oh, like when a politician dodges a tough question by pivoting to a completely different topic.
Exactly. The book also delves into other tactics like agreement and approval, where you feign agreement to mask your ignorance.
I've definitely used that one before.
Yeah.
And then there's attribution, right? Citing supposedly reputable sources.
Yes, to give your statements more weight, even if those sources don't actually support your claims.
Clever, but also a bit sneaky. What other tactics fall under this seeming confidence skill?
Well, there's counter questions. You basically turn the tables on the person asking you the question.
Shifting the focus away from yourself.
Right. And then there's silence and vagueness, creating an aura of mystery.
So people assume you know more than you're letting on.
Precisely. All right, moving on to the second skill. This one's all about appearances.
Made dazzling with appearance. I could already see where this is going.
It's about leveraging the halo effect. You know, that cognitive bias where one positive trait can overshadow others?
Oh, absolutely. Like when you meet someone attractive.
You automatically assume they're also intelligent or trustworthy. The book actually highlights an experiment where they found
People were much more patient.
when a luxury car was blocking the road, compared to a cheap car.
Oh, wow. So our initial judgments are heavily influenced by appearances.
It seems so. Jachtchenko argues that first impressions really do matter, and we can manipulate those perceptions.
By dressing well, projecting confidence.
Exactly. Okay, so skill number 3 is all about building rapport quickly.
Building quick rapport. This one sounds intriguing.
The key here is mirroring. It involves subtly mimicking the other person's behavior.
Their body language, word choices, even their opinions.
Yes. Jachtchenko tells this funny anecdote about mirroring a woman's love for Pete Sampras.
Even though he didn't follow tennis at all.
Exactly. It worked like a charm. But this raises a question, doesn't it? How can we differentiate between genuine connection
and manipulative mirroring?
That's the challenge. Think about those people who seem to agree with everything you say. Are they truly engaged or just reflecting your views?
That's a good point. I'll definitely be paying more attention to that now. Okay, what's the next manipulation skill?
This one's a bit more ethically ambiguous. It's about telling the perfect lie.
Okay, this should be interesting. I think we all lie sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. The book acknowledges that everyone engages in some form of deception.
From little white lies to more serious fabrications. So what's the key to telling a convincing lie?
For starters, you need to control your body language. Establish a baseline, so to speak. Then craft a believable story.
And practice it backward, which sounds pretty counterintuitive.
It helps you anticipate any inconsistencies. The book also stresses the importance of using personal pronouns.
Sound more sincere.
Exactly. But beyond outright falsehoods, the book also explores half-truths.
So it's not just about lying, but also about strategically manipulating the information you share.
Precisely. This could involve blending truth with fabrication, withholding key information.
Or using ambiguous language. It really makes you wonder, even if we can master these skills, should we? Is there a line we shouldn't cross, even for the sake of exploration in this deep dive? It's definitely something to think about. What's the next skill on the list?
Well, this one's called forcing agreement. It plays on a psychological principle called commitment and consistency.
What does that mean?
Basically, people feel compelled to align their actions with their prior commitments, even small ones.
So if you can get someone to agree to a minor request.
They're more likely to agree to a bigger one later. Classic sales tactic.
I've definitely fallen for that before. The foot in the door technique. What are some other tactics based on this principle?
Well, there's the door in the face tactic, where you start with an outrageous request.
And then scale back to a smaller one that seems more reasonable by comparison.
Exactly. And then there's lowballing, where you hide the true cost until the person is already committed.
Oh, I hate that. Those hidden fees and escalating costs. It's like they're intentionally trying to trick you.
Exactly. These tactics are designed to exploit our natural tendency for consistency. What about skill number 6?
Let's see. Steering with questions. So it's about more than just asking basic questions.
Oh, much more. This is about using specific types of questions to guide the conversation and extract information.
Oh, so it's about using questions strategically.
Yes. For example, Jachtchenko talks about hidden questions. These are questions that indirectly extract information.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you want to know if someone is married. Instead of asking directly, you could casually ask about their weekend plans.
And if they mention their spouse, you've got your answer. Sneaky.
There are also either-or questions, which limit the choices. It's a classic sales tactic.
Like, would you prefer the red one or the blue one? Even if there are other colors available.
Exactly. The book goes on to list several other manipulative question types.
Flattering, attacking, leading, suggestive, quickfire, echo, and provocative. Wow, that's quite a toolbox.
It is. And recognizing these in your own conversations can be really insightful.
Okay, on to skill number 7. Overwhelming with emotions. This one sounds powerful.
It is. Emotions can be incredibly persuasive. They often bypass logic and reason.
I can definitely relate to that. So how can emotions be manipulated?
Well, one tactic is feigned outrage. Think of a child throwing a tantrum to get what they want.
Oh, I've seen that tactic used plenty of times.
It's surprisingly effective even with adults.
It's all about creating a scene and making the other person feel guilty or intimidated.
Exactly. There's also the appeal to pity, playing the victim to gain sympathy.
Those sad animal shelter commercials are a perfect example.
They really tug at your heartstrings. And then there's moral blackmail, which leverages social expectations.
It's like saying a good person would do this.
It preys on people's desire to be seen as virtuous. These tactics are all about exploiting our emotions.
To achieve a desired outcome. It's fascinating, but also a bit scary, how easily we can be swayed by our emotions.
It is. Developing emotional intelligence is crucial for recognizing and resisting these tactics. All right, what about skill number 8?
Attacking content. So this one's about going after the argument itself.
Exactly. It shifts from emotions to logic, aiming to dismantle the other person's reasoning.
Like an intellectual duel.
Precisely. One tactic is the straw man, where you misrepresent your opponent's argument.
To make it easier to attack. It's a classic debating tactic.
Right. Then there's the infinite regress, where you just keep asking why until they run out of answers.
Oh, I used to do that to my parents all the time as a kid. It was so much fun to watch them get flustered.
It can be pretty effective, especially if you're trying to derail a conversation. The book also lists other techniques.
Like accusation of irrelevance, turning the tables, and reductio ad absurdum.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many different ways there are to attack an argument.
It is. Developing strong critical thinking skills is essential for recognizing and countering these tactics.
Okay, what about skill number 9?
Well, this one is attacking the person. It's probably the most ethically questionable of all the skills.
Right, because it's about discrediting the person, not the argument.
Exactly. The book explores different types of personal attacks.
Like outright insults, which are pretty self-explanatory.
Right. Then there's poisoning the well, which involves preemptively discrediting someone.
Before they can even speak. That's pretty nasty.
And then there's the classic tu quoque, which is all about pointing out hypocrisy.
It's basically deflecting criticism by saying, you do it too.
Exactly. These tactics are all about shifting the focus away from the argument,
and onto the person's character or past behavior.
which can be very effective, but it's also important to consider the ethical implication.
Okay, on to the final skill, shutting down conversations. I'm guessing this is about avoiding unwanted debates.
Exactly. The book offers a variety of techniques for gracefully or not so gracefully exiting a conversation.
So when you just don't want to engage anymore,
Right. One tactic is stonewalling, which is basically refusing to respond.
just ignoring them completely, that seems a bit rude.
It can be, but it can also be effective if you're dealing with someone who is being unreasonable. There's also relativism.
Oh, like saying everyone's entitled to their own opinion.
Exactly. It's a way of dismissing the other person's viewpoint without actually engaging with it.
The book also lists other tactics, like thought-terminating cliches, flattery and approval, counter questions, and delaying tactics. It's amazing how many different ways there are to shut down a conversation.
It is, but it's also important to remember that sometimes it's better to disengage from a conversation than to prolong it.
Especially if it's becoming heated or unproductive. Wow, this exploration of the top 10 manipulation skills has been incredibly illuminating.
It has. It really highlights the subtle ways we can influence each other, both consciously and unconsciously.
But wait, there's more. Jachtchenko goes beyond these 10 skills and introduces what he calls the 3 boxes of dirty communication tricks. Let's start with the first box. What's inside?
The first box focuses on cognitive biases, those mental shortcuts our brains use.
Which can be exploited by those who are skilled in manipulation.
Exactly. These biases are like vulnerabilities in our thinking. They make us susceptible to certain types of persuasion.
Okay, so what's the first bias we're going to explore?
Let's start with the superiority bias. This is the tendency for most people to believe they are above average.
In various areas like intelligence, abilities, or even driving skills.
Exactly. It's this inflated self-perception that we all seem to have.
That's a bit humbling, isn't it?
It is. The book cites several studies where participants consistently rate themselves above average.
Which statistically is impossible. So how can this bias be exploited?
Well, those who have a strong superiority bias are particularly susceptible to flattery.
Oh, so if you stroke their ego,
They're more likely to agree with you. It makes them feel good about themselves.
it's like using praise to manipulate someone.
Exactly. And this bias can also lead to overconfidence, which can make people make poor decisions.
Which a skilled manipulator can then capitalize on.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to the next cognitive bias, confirmation bias. This one's all about seeking out information.
That confirms our existing beliefs.
Right. Even if that information is inaccurate or incomplete, it's like we filter out anything that challenges our worldview.
So if I already believe something strongly, I'm more likely to pay attention to information that supports it.
Even if that information is flawed, manipulators can exploit this by selectively feeding you information.
That reinforces your biases.
Exactly. It's like creating an echo chamber where you only hear what you want to hear.
That's scary. How can we counter this bias?
Well, the first step is to be aware of it, both in ourselves and in others.
We need to be willing to consider different viewpoints and challenge our own assumptions.
Exactly. It's not easy, but it's essential if we want to avoid being manipulated.
What's the next cognitive bias on the list?
This one's called attentional bias. It's the tendency to focus on certain aspects of information.
While neglecting others.
Right. It's like our brains have a limited capacity for attention.
So we selectively attend to what we perceive as relevant or important.
Exactly. The book actually describes a fascinating experiment called the monkey business illusion.
Oh, I've seen that video. It's the one where you're supposed to count the basketball passes.
And you completely miss the gorilla walking across the screen.
It's amazing how easily our brains can filter out information. Even something as obvious as a gorilla.
It is. And skilled manipulators can use this to their advantage.
By directing our attention to what they want us to see.
And distracting us from what they don't want us to see.
It's like a magician using misdirection.
Exactly. So it's important to be aware of our own attentional biases.
And to actively seek out a wider range of perspectives.
Precisely. Okay, moving on to another bias. Cognitive dissonance. This one's all about the mental discomfort.
We experience when we hold conflicting beliefs or engage in behaviors that contradict our values.
Exactly. The book describes a classic experiment where participants were paid to lie about enjoying a boring task.
And the ones who were paid less experienced more cognitive dissonance.
Right. They actually convinced themselves that the task was enjoyable to reduce their discomfort.
Wow, so they actually change their perception of the experience to align with their
It's
actions,
incredible, isn't it? It shows just how powerful this internal conflict can be.
and how manipulators can exploit it to get us to rationalize our actions.
Exactly. They can create situations that induce cognitive dissonance.
And then offer us a way to resolve that dissonance by changing our beliefs.
Exactly. It's a very subtle but effective form of manipulation. What's next?
Let's see, priming. This one sounds interesting.
Priming is the phenomenon where exposure to certain stimuli subconsciously influences our thoughts and actions.
So if I encounter certain words or images,
It can affect how I react in a later situation, even if I'm not aware of it.
can you give us an example?
Sure, the book mentions a study where participants were exposed to words associated with old age.
Like wrinkles and gray hair.
Exactly. And then those participants actually walked slower, even though slowness was never explicitly mentioned.
That's amazing. Just hearing those words triggered a physical response.
It's incredible, isn't it? And this is how priming can be used for manipulation.
By strategically exposing us to stimuli that prime us to act or think in a certain way.
Precisely. It's like planting seeds in our minds that later blossom into specific behaviors or perceptions.
Okay, what's the next bias on the list?
This one's called anchoring. It's the tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information we receive.
Even if that information is irrelevant or inaccurate.
Exactly. It's like our minds get fixated on that initial anchor as a reference point.
So if someone gives me a random number,
It can influence how I estimate something completely unrelated.
really? That sounds crazy.
It is. The book describes an experiment where participants were asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN,
Yeah.
but before they answered, they were shown a random number generated by a wheel of fortune.
And that random number influenced their estimate,
Exactly. Those who saw a higher number estimated a higher percentage.
even though the number was completely irrelevant to the question.
Right. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. So how can this anchoring effect be used for manipulation
Well, manipulators can establish an initial anchor.
that influences our subsequent judgments?
Exactly. It's like setting the stage for a desired outcome by subtly influencing our thinking.
Okay, what's the next cognitive bias we need to be aware of?
This one's a big one. Social proof. It's the tendency to conform to the actions or beliefs of others.
Especially in ambiguous situations.
Exactly. We look to others for cues on how to behave.
So if everyone else is doing something, we assume it must be the right thing to do.
Exactly. The book highlights the classic Asch conformity experiment.
Oh, I remember learning about that in psychology class.
It's where participants conform to blatantly incorrect answers given by a group of Confederates.
To fit in with the group.
Exactly. It shows just how powerful social pressure can be.
And how manipulators can exploit that pressure to get us to conform to their ideas or actions.
Precisely. Okay, ready for the next one.
Sure, what's next?
Wishful thinking. This is the tendency to believe something is true.
Because we want it to be true.
Exactly. Even if the evidence is weak or non-existent, our desires can cloud our judgment.
So I might ignore warning signs about a risky investment.
Because you really want it to pay off.
And a manipulator could exploit that desire by painting a rosy picture.
That aligns with my wishes, even if it's unrealistic.
It's like selling a dream.
Exactly. Being aware of wishful thinking can help us make more rational decisions.
Especially when our emotions are involved.
Um,
Okay, what's the next bias on our list?
Processing fluency. It refers to the ease with which our brains process information.
So if something is easy to understand,
We're more likely to believe it. It just feels more familiar and trustworthy.
so a clear and simple message is more persuasive than a complex one.
Often, yes. Manipulators can exploit this by presenting their ideas in a very straightforward way.
Even if those ideas are deceptive or incomplete.
Precisely. It's about making things sound simple, even if they're not.
What's the next bias on our list?
Let's talk about the primacy effect. This is the tendency to be more influenced by information presented first.
First impressions matter.
Exactly. The book describes an experiment where participants formed different impressions of a person based on the order in which their traits were presented.
So if they heard positive traits first, they had a more favorable impression overall.
Exactly, even if negative traits were presented later.
The order in which we receive information can really affect our judgments.
It can. And manipulators can use this to their advantage by presenting their most favorable information up front.
To create a positive first impression.
Exactly. It's all about setting the stage for how we want people to perceive us or our ideas.
This exploration of cognitive biases has been fascinating. It's like uncovering all these hidden vulnerabilities in our thinking.
It is. And it shows just how easily our brains can be tricked. But don't worry, we're going to learn how to protect ourselves from these manipulations.
That's reassuring. Okay, let's move on to the next box of tricks. What's inside the verbal tricks box?
This box is all about the power of language.
How words can be used to influence us.
Exactly. We're going to explore some of the most common verbal tricks used by manipulators.
I'm ready to learn some new vocabulary. What's the first trick on the list?
Let's start with technical terms and foreign words.
Oh, I can already see how this one works.
It's about using jargon and fancy-sounding phrases.
To make yourself sound smarter.
Precisely. People are often intimidated by unfamiliar terminology.
And they're less likely to question someone who uses it confidently.
Exactly. It creates an aura of expertise, even if the person doesn't actually know what they're talking about.
So it's a way of using language to obscure meaning and avoid scrutiny.
Exactly. What about weak language and power talking?
Okay, what's the difference?
Weak language uses hesitant phrases, fillers, tag questions, and apologies.
It makes you sound uncertain and lacking in confidence.
Exactly. Power talking, on the other hand, is all about using strong, assertive language.
Clear statements, direct questions. It makes you sound more authoritative.
Precisely. The same message can be perceived very differently depending on the language used.
It's like the difference between saying, I think this might be a good idea versus this is a good idea.
Exactly. Being aware of how our language affects our perceived credibility can be very empowering.
Okay, what's the next verbal trick on the list?
Let's talk about repetition.
As in saying the same thing over and over again,
Exactly. The more we hear something, the more likely we are to believe it.
even if it's not true.
Exactly. Repetition can make a message feel more familiar and trustworthy, even if it's completely baseless.
That's kind of scary.
It is. Propaganda often relies heavily on repetition.
To embed certain ideas in people's minds.
Exactly. So it's important to be aware of this tactic and to critically evaluate information regardless of how often you hear it.
Okay, what's next?
Framing. This is about how the way information is presented can influence our perception of it.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but how they're arranged.
Exactly. The same information can be framed positively or negatively.
To evoke different emotions and associations.
Precisely. For example, a company might highlight the positive features of their product.
While downplaying the negative ones.
Exactly. Or a politician might frame a policy in a way that appeals to their base.
Even if it's misleading or inaccurate.
Right. Being aware of framing techniques can help us make more informed decisions.
Okay, what's the next verbal trick on the list?
Metaphors. These are figures of speech that create vivid imagery and emotional associations.
So they can make complex ideas more relatable.
They can, but they can also be used to oversimplify matters and establish false equivalences.
Can you give an example?
Sure, think about the metaphor of government as a business.
Oh, I've heard that one before.
It sounds appealing, but it's actually a very misleading metaphor.
Because governments are not businesses.
Exactly. They have different goals and operate under different constraints.
So metaphors can be powerful tools for persuasion, but they can also be dangerous if they're not used carefully.
Exactly. What about loaded language?
Okay, what's that?
Loaded language uses words and phrases that have strong emotional connotations.
To evoke specific feelings or reactions.
Precisely. It's about manipulating emotions rather than conveying information objectively.
So it's like using words as weapons.
In a way, yes. For example, labeling someone as a radical or a fanatic can trigger negative emotions.
Without providing any evidence to support those claims.
Exactly. Being aware of loaded language can help us avoid being swayed by emotional appeals.
Okay, what's next?
Because justification. This one's interesting.
How can the word because be manipulative?
Well, it turns out that the word because can create an illusion of legitimacy.
Even if the reason provided is flimsy or irrelevant.
Exactly. The book cites an experiment where people were more likely to allow someone to cut in line at a copy machine if they gave any reason at all.
Even if the reason was something as simple as because I need to make copies.
Right. The word because just seems to trigger a compliance response in us.
So it's important to be aware of this tendency and to critically evaluate the reasons people give us.
Exactly. Don't just accept things at face value because someone says because.
Okay, what's next on our verbal trick adventure?
Vocal nuances. This one's about how our tone of voice, pitch, and volume can affect how our message is received.
So it's not just about the words we say, but how we say them.
Exactly. The book emphasizes that confident body language and a strong voice enhance persuasiveness.
While hesitant speech and weak body language detract from it,
Exactly. It's about projecting an image of confidence and authority.
even if you don't feel confident.
Sometimes, yes. It's about using your voice and body language to create a certain impression.
That's fascinating. Okay, what's the last verbal trick we're going to look at?
Quotations.
As in, quoting other people.
Exactly. Using quotations, especially from authoritative figures, can lend credibility to an argument.
Even if the quote is taken out of context or the source is unreliable.
Exactly. It's a way of borrowing someone else's credibility to boost your own argument.
So I could cherry pick a quote from a famous scientist.
To support my argument about climate change, even if that scientist never actually said anything about climate change.
That's sneaky.
It is. And it's important to be aware of this tactic, especially when you're evaluating information online.
Always check the source and the context of any quotes you see.
Exactly. Okay, I think that covers all of the verbal tricks.
Wow, that was a lot of information. I'm starting to feel like I need a degree in manipulation just to keep up with all of these tactics.
It can be overwhelming, but remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about these techniques, the better equipped you'll be to recognize and resist them.
You're right. Okay, let's move on to the final box of tricks. What's inside the bogus arguments box?
This box is all about logical fallacies. These are arguments that sound convincing, but they're actually based on faulty reasoning.
So they're like tricks of logic.
Exactly. They're designed to mislead us into accepting conclusions that aren't actually supported by the evidence.
Okay, I'm ready to put my critical thinking skills to the test. What's the first bogus argument we're going to debunk?
Let's start with the irrelevance technique. This one's all about avoiding the real issue.
By responding with irrelevant information.
Exactly. Politicians use this tactic all the time.
To dodge tough questions or to change the subject.
Exactly. It's a way of sidestepping the issue and avoiding accountability.
So if I ask a politician about their stance on a particular policy,
They might respond with a story about their childhood.
that has absolutely nothing to do with the policy in question.
Exactly. It's a classic diversion tactic.
Okay, what's the next bogus argument on our list?
The appeal to tradition. This one claims that something must be true or good.
Simply because it's been done that way for a long time.
Exactly. It's the "we've always done it this way" argument.
But just because something has been done a certain way in the past doesn't mean it's still the best way to do it.
Exactly. The world is constantly changing, and what worked in the past might not work now.
So we should be wary of arguments that rely solely on tradition.
We should. We need to critically evaluate traditions and decide whether they're still relevant and beneficial.
Okay, what's next?
The personal attack, also known as ad hominem.
Oh, I know this one. It's about attacking the person making the argument.
Instead of addressing the argument itself.
So if someone disagrees with me, I could try to discredit them by bringing up their past mistakes,
Or their personal flaws. Host. Or their personal flaws.
even if those things have nothing to do with the argument at hand.
Exactly. It's a way of trying to win an argument by making the other person look bad.
Instead of actually engaging with their ideas.
Precisely. What about the next bogus argument?
Circular argument. What does that mean?
A circular argument uses its conclusion as a premise to support itself.
So it's like saying, this is true because it's true?
Exactly. It's a logical loop that doesn't actually prove anything.
It's like saying, the Bible is the word of God because the Bible says so.
Exactly. That's a classic example of a circular argument.
Okay, what's next?
The slippery slope. This one argues that taking a particular action,
Will inevitably lead to a series of negative consequences.
even though there's no evidence to support that claim.
So it's like saying, if we legalize marijuana, then everyone will start using heroin.
Exactly. It's a way of scaring people into opposing something by exaggerating the potential consequences.
But it's not always easy to tell whether a slippery slope argument is valid or not.
That's true. It's important to critically evaluate the evidence and to consider whether the predicted consequences are actually likely to occur.
Okay, what's the next bogus argument on our list?
Appeal to common sense. This one claims that something must be true.
Because it's just common sense.
Exactly. But common sense isn't always a reliable guide to truth.
What do you mean?
Well, common sense is often based on our own personal experiences and biases.
So what might seem like common sense to one person might not seem like common sense to another person.
Exactly. And common sense can also be influenced by cultural norms and traditions.
So it's important to be skeptical of arguments that rely solely on common sense.
We should. We need to demand evidence and to be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Okay, what's next?
The false dilemma. This one presents only two options.
When there are actually more possibilities.
Exactly. It's a way of oversimplifying a complex issue.
And forcing people to choose between two extremes,
Precisely. A classic example is the "you're either with us or against us" argument.
which ignores the possibility of neutrality or of having a different perspective altogether.
Exactly. Recognizing false dilemmas can help us to avoid being manipulated into making choices that we don't actually want to make.
Okay, what's next?
Repetition. Ad nauseum. We talked about repetition as a verbal trick, but it can also be used as a bogus argument.
How so?
Well, it basically involves repeating a claim over and over again.
Even if there's no evidence to support it.
Exactly. The idea is that if you hear something enough times, you'll start to believe it.
Even if it's not true.
Exactly. It's a very effective form of propaganda.
So we need to be wary of claims that are repeated frequently without any evidence to back them up.
We do. Just because something is said often doesn't make it true.
Okay, what's next?
Anecdotal evidence. This one relies on personal stories or isolated incidents.
To support a claim.
Exactly. But anecdotes are not the same as evidence.
What do you mean?
Well, anecdotes are often subjective and unreliable.
They might be true for the person telling the story, but that doesn't mean they're true in general.
Exactly. And anecdotes can also be easily cherry-picked.
Meaning that someone might only tell you the stories that support their point of view.
Precisely. So it's important to be skeptical of anecdotal evidence and to demand more rigorous proof.
Okay, what's next?
The cum hoc fallacy. This one is Latin for "with this, therefore because of this."
Sounds complicated.
It's actually pretty simple. It's the mistaken belief that correlation equals causation.
So just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that one caused the other.
Exactly. There could be a third factor that's causing both things to happen.
Or it could just be a coincidence.
Right. So it's important to be careful about drawing causal conclusions from correlational data.
Okay, what's the next fallacy on our list?
Appeal to self-interest. This one argues that something must be true or good.
Because it benefits the listener.
Exactly. It's a way of appealing to people's selfish desires.
So a politician might argue for a tax cut by saying that it will put more money in people's pockets.
Even if the tax cut would actually benefit the wealthy more than the poor.
Or a company might try to sell you a product by saying that it will make you more attractive.
Even if there's no evidence to support that claim.
So it's important to be aware of this tactic and to think critically about whether something is actually in our best interests.
We should. We need to consider the bigger picture and to think about the potential consequences of our actions.
Okay, what's next?
The false compromise. This one claims that the truth lies somewhere between two opposing viewpoints.
Even if one of those viewpoints is clearly wrong.
Exactly. It's a way of trying to find a middle ground where there is none.
So if one person believes that the Earth is flat, and another person believes that the Earth is round,
A false compromise would be to say that the Earth is actually a cube.
it's ridiculous.
It is. But false compromises can be very tempting, especially when we're trying to avoid conflict.
So it's important to be willing to stand up for what we believe in, even if it means disagreeing with others.
We should. Truth is not always a matter of compromise.
Okay, what's the final fallacy on our list?
The argument from ignorance. This one claims that something must be true.
Because it hasn't been proven false.
Exactly. Or vice versa.
So you could say that ghosts must exist because no one has been able to prove that they don't.
Exactly. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Just because we haven't been able to prove something false doesn't mean that it's true.
Exactly. The burden of proof lies with the person making the claim.
So if someone claims that something is true, they need to provide evidence to support that claim.
They do. We shouldn't just accept things at face value because we don't know any better.
Wow, this exploration of bogus arguments has been quite the journey. It's amazing how many ways there are to deceive people with seemingly logical arguments.
It is. But by learning about these fallacies, we can protect ourselves from being misled.
You're right. Knowledge is power. Okay, I think we've covered all three boxes of dirty communication tricks.
We have. We've explored cognitive biases, verbal tricks, and bogus arguments.
It's like we've been given a crash course in the art of manipulation.
In a way, yes. But remember, the goal isn't to become master manipulators ourselves.
It's to become more aware of these tactics so that we can recognize them when they're being used against us.
Exactly. And to make more conscious and ethical choices about how we communicate with others.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. It's amazing how much there is to learn about the psychology of persuasion. I feel like I need to go back and re-listen to this whole episode again just to absorb it all.
It is a lot to take in, but hopefully it's been eye-opening. Just remember, the key takeaway is that manipulation is everywhere.
And by understanding how it works, we can better protect ourselves from being manipulated.
Exactly. And we can use this knowledge to become more effective communicators ourselves.
Well said. The book also delves into the ethical aspects of manipulation, which is something we haven't really touched on yet. Jachtchenko doesn't shy away from the moral complexities of these tactics. He wants us to really grapple with the question of whether manipulation is inherently wrong.
It's an important question, and one that doesn't have a simple answer.
Right. It's not always black and white. There are shades of gray.
Hmm.
So how does Jachtchenko address the ethical implications of manipulation?
Well, he argues that it all comes down to intent and outcome. It's not about labeling manipulation as good or bad. It's about understanding the context in which it's used.
So a white lie to spare someone's feelings might be considered ethically acceptable.
While deceiving someone for financial gain would be condemned,
It makes sense. The intention behind the manipulation matters.
it does. Jachtchenko actually proposes a framework for ethical manipulation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the framework?
Well, he suggests that ethical manipulation should be guided by the golden rule.
Treat others as you would like to be treated.
Exactly. It's about using these techniques responsibly and empathetically.
Considering the well-being of others.
Precisely. Jachtchenko argues that manipulation can be neutral or even beneficial.
When it doesn't harm others and is aligned with their best interests.
Right. For example, a doctor might use persuasive techniques to encourage a patient to quit smoking.
Or a parent might use reverse psychology to get their child to eat their vegetables.
Exactly. In these cases, the manipulation is being used to help the other person.
But even with good intentions, manipulation can still feel deceptive.
That's the challenge. It's a delicate balance. Jachtchenko encourages us to be more conscious of our own manipulative behaviors.
And to strive for transparency and authenticity in our interactions.
Exactly. It's about being honest with ourselves and with others about our motivations.
This has been a truly thought-provoking exploration of the Manipulation Bible. Jachtchenko really challenges us to examine our own communication patterns.
And to think critically about the ways in which we influence each other.
This book isn't just about learning how to manipulate others.
It's about becoming more aware of the subtle ways in which we're all being manipulated on a daily basis.
And by understanding these tactics, we can make more informed choices about how we interact with the world around us.
Exactly.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Manipulation Bible. It's a book that I highly recommend to anyone who wants to better understand the psychology of persuasion.
It's definitely a worthwhile read.
Before we wrap up, let's recap some of the key takeaways from the Manipulation Bible. Would you mind walking us through those one last time?
Absolutely. Here are 10 key insights to keep in mind. First, manipulation is everywhere. It's not just something that con artists or politicians do. We all engage in it to some degree, often without even realizing it.
It's important to remember that.
Second, intent matters. Manipulation can be used for good or for evil. The key is to be aware of your motivations and the potential consequences of your actions.
Right. It's not about labeling manipulation as inherently good or bad. It's about understanding the context and the intent behind it.
Exactly. Third, appearances matter. First impressions are powerful, and you can use the halo effect to your advantage by presenting yourself in a positive light.
It's amazing how much our initial judgments are influenced by appearances.
It is. Fourth, building rapport is key. Mirroring someone's behavior can help you establish trust and connection, but be mindful of authenticity.
It's a delicate balance between building rapport and being genuine.
It is. Fifth, lying is a slippery slope. Even white lies can erode trust. Be honest whenever possible and be prepared to face the consequences if you're caught in a lie.
Honesty is always the best policy.
Sixth, commitment and consistency are powerful tools. Once people commit to something, they're more likely to follow through. You can use this to your advantage, but be careful not to exploit others.
It's about using these principles ethically.
Exactly. Seventh, questions can be manipulative. Be aware of how different types of questions can be used to steer a conversation or extract information.
It's not just about asking questions, it's about asking the right questions in the right way.
Precisely. Eighth, emotions are powerful motivators. People are more likely to make decisions based on how they feel than on logic. Be aware of how emotions can be used to manipulate you.
It's important to be aware of our own emotional vulnerabilities.
It is. Ninth, logic can be twisted. Be wary of bogus arguments that sound convincing but are actually fallacious.
We've covered a lot of those today. It's amazing how easily we can be fooled by faulty reasoning.
It is. Tenth, and finally, knowledge is power. By understanding the techniques of manipulation, you can protect yourself from being manipulated and use them ethically to achieve your goals.
Those are incredibly valuable insights. Thank you for sharing those with us.
You're welcome.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this captivating exploration of the Manipulation Bible.
Right.
Remember, awareness is the first step toward making more conscious and ethical communication choices. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. So it sounds like manipulation can be used for a variety of purposes, not all of them bad.
Exactly. It's not a simple black and white issue. There's a whole spectrum of manipulation with varying degrees of ethicality.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you break that down for us? Like, what would be the most unethical type of manipulation?
Well, at the far end of the spectrum, we have what Jachtchenko calls malicious manipulation. This is where someone intentionally sets out to harm others for personal gain.
So we're talking about things like scams, coercion, abuse.
Exactly. Those are clear-cut cases of using manipulation for nefarious purposes.
Okay, that makes sense. What about situations where the harm isn't intentional?
That would fall under what he calls selfish manipulation. You might benefit from your actions, but someone else is unintentionally harmed in the process.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's say you exaggerate your qualifications to get a job. You might get the job, but you could be preventing someone more qualified from getting it.
Ah, I see. So it's a situation where you're prioritizing your own gain, even if it means potentially disadvantaging someone else.
Exactly. It's ethically ambiguous, to say the least.
Definitely a gray area.
Mm.
What about situations where no one is really harmed or benefited?
Jachtchenko refers to that as neutral manipulation. You're essentially using manipulation to get what you want, but without any significant impact on others.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Think about haggling for a lower price at a flea market. You're using persuasive techniques to get a better deal for yourself.
But the seller isn't necessarily losing out as long as they're still making a profit.
Exactly. It's a win-win situation, even if some manipulation is involved.
Interesting perspective. So, haggling is a form of ethically neutral manipulation. What about situations where both parties actually benefit?
That's what he calls helpful manipulation. Both you and the other person gain something, even if they might not be fully aware of the persuasive tactics being used.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Think of a parent who encourages their child to eat vegetables by arranging them in fun shapes on their plate.
It's a clever way to promote healthy eating habits.
Exactly. The child benefits by getting the nutrients they need, and the parent benefits by knowing their child is eating well.
So both parties win, even though the parent is using a bit of manipulation to achieve that outcome.
Exactly. What about when the manipulation is purely for the benefit of the other person?
Okay, so this would be a situation where someone is being manipulated, but it's actually in their best interest?
Exactly. Jachtchenko calls this altruistic manipulation. Your actions are solely focused on benefiting the other person, even if it means putting yourself at a disadvantage.
Can you give us an example of this?
Sure. Imagine a doctor who needs to convince a reluctant patient to undergo a life-saving procedure.
The patient might not want to go through with it, but the doctor knows it's the best course of action.
Exactly. The doctor's manipulation stems from a place of compassion and a genuine desire to help the patient.
So even though manipulation is involved, it's ultimately for the patient's own good.
Precisely. It highlights the complex nature of manipulation and how it can be used for both positive and negative purposes.
This whole spectrum of manipulation is really fascinating. It's making me think about all the different ways I might be using manipulation in my own life, both consciously and unconsciously.
That's the point. Jachtchenko wants us to be more aware of our own manipulative behaviors.
And to strive for more transparency and authenticity in our interaction.
Exactly. It's about being honest with ourselves and with others about our motivations.
It's also about recognizing that manipulation isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it can be used to achieve positive outcomes.
It can. The key is to use it ethically and responsibly.
Well said. This deep dive into the Manipulation Bible has really opened my eyes to the complex world of persuasion. It's a book that I'll definitely be recommending to others.
Me too. It's a valuable resource for anyone who wants to better understand how we influence each other.
Well, before we wrap up, let's give our listeners a quick recap of the key takeaways from the Manipulation Bible. Could you summarize those for us one last time?
Absolutely. Here are 10 key insights to keep in mind. First, manipulation is everywhere. It's not just something that con artists or politicians do. We all engage in it to some degree, often without even realizing it.
It's like a hidden language that we all speak, whether we're aware of it or not.
Exactly. Second, intent matters. Manipulation can be used for good or for evil. The key is to be aware of your motivations and the potential consequences of your actions.
It's not about labeling manipulation as inherently good or bad. It's about understanding the context and the intent behind it.
Precisely. Third, appearances matter. First impressions are powerful, and you can use the halo effect to your advantage by presenting yourself in a positive light.
It's amazing how much our initial judgments can be influenced by superficial factors like appearance.
It is. Fourth, building rapport is key. Mirroring someone's behavior can help you establish trust and connection. But be mindful of authenticity.
It's a delicate balance. You don't want to come across as fake or insincere.
Exactly. Fifth, lying is a slippery slope. Even white lies can erode trust. Be honest whenever possible and be prepared to face the consequences if you're caught in a lie.
Honesty is always the best policy, even if it's not always easy.
I agree. Sixth, commitment and consistency are powerful tools. Once people commit to something, they're more likely to follow through. You can use this to your advantage, but be careful not to exploit others.
It's important to use these principles ethically.
Exactly. Seventh, questions can be manipulative. Be aware of how different types of questions can be used to steer a conversation or extract information.
It's not just about asking questions. It's about asking the right questions in the right way.
Precisely. Eighth, emotions are powerful motivators. People are more likely to make decisions based on how they feel than on logic. Be aware of how emotions can be used to manipulate you.
It's important to develop emotional intelligence so that we can recognize and manage our own emotions.
It is. Ninth, logic can be twisted. Be wary of bogus arguments that sound convincing but are actually fallacious.
We've covered a lot of those today. It's amazing how easily we can be fooled by faulty reasoning.
It is. Critical thinking skills are essential for navigating the world of information.
Absolutely. And finally, number 10, knowledge is power. By understanding the techniques of manipulation, you can protect yourself from being manipulated and use them ethically to achieve your goals. Those are some fantastic insights. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. This deep dive into the Manipulation Bible has been incredibly enlightening, and I know our listeners will get a lot out of it.
I hope so. It's been a pleasure discussing this with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of manipulation tactics. Remember, awareness is the first step toward making more conscious and ethical choices in your communication. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.